What does it take to silence a man who has everything: money, influence, power, and a voice that once commanded entire boardrooms? Have you ever wondered how someone at the top of the world can suddenly vanish into silence, not because he lost his fortune, but because he lost something far greater? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. In the heart of New York City, where the skyline stretches like a monument to ambition, John Mitchell once lived as a symbol of success. A self-made millionaire, his name echoed in Wall Street offices, charity galas, and luxury circles. People spoke about him with both admiration and envy. He had built his empire from nothing, and for years he wore his resilience like armor. But now, that armor lies cracked, and behind it stands a man who refuses to speak. Imagine a penthouse high above Manhattan, walls of glass reflecting the city lights, yet inside, complete stillness. No phone calls, no instructions to assistants, no laughter, not even the echo of his own voice. For weeks, John has chosen silence, not because he has nothing to say, but because speaking would mean confronting the pain he has been hiding, a pain so heavy that even a fortune cannot lighten it. Have you ever been through this, when words feel too weak to hold the weight of your grief? Behind the sharp suits and expensive watches, John carries a devastating truth. He has just lost the love of his life. The woman who once softened the edges of his hardened world is gone. And while the city moves on, rushing through crowded streets and noisy subways, John stays frozen in place. He buries himself in his wealth, hoping the gold around him might shield him from the darkness within. But silence, no matter how thick, cannot erase the sound of an empty heart. And this is where the contrast begins to grow. Just blocks away from John's glass tower, there's a very different world. A small orphanage filled with children who own almost nothing. No parents, no inheritance, no safety net. Yet every day these children laugh, play, and fight for joy with a courage that money can't buy. It's in this place, far removed from John's world of power, that fate prepares an encounter he never could have predicted. Because sometimes it's not another millionaire, a therapist, or a friend that can break through a wall of silence. Sometimes it's the most unexpected voice, or in this case, no voice at all. Just a simple gesture from someone who has also known loss but wears it differently. What happens when a man who refuses to cry meets a child who refuses to give up on him? What happens when innocence collides with pride and vulnerability exposes strength in a way that wealth never could? John doesn't know it yet, but the day he crosses paths with a boy named Ethan, his silence will finally be shattered. Not by arguments, not by money, not by force, but by something far simpler and far more powerful. Stay with me until the end, because this story carries a lesson about humanity, about the true meaning of strength, and about how even the most broken soul can be touched by the smallest act of love. And so, in the middle of New York, where steel towers scrape the sky and men like John are expected to be unshakable, a child will do what no fortune could ever achieve. The stage is set, the silence is deafening, and what comes next may just change everything. And maybe as you're listening, you can feel a part of yourself in John's silence, the moments when you too carried a weight so heavy that words seemed useless. Maybe you've had a time in life when the world expected you to be strong, but all you wanted was for someone to notice the cracks. If this stirs something inside you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your own experience, or even just how this story resonates with you. It's in those comments that this channel becomes more than a story. It becomes a community, a place where people connect through emotion and reflection. And if you're finding meaning here, if this kind of story makes you pause and see the world a little differently, take a moment to like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but that simple click helps more people discover these stories of humanity, kindness, and redemption. And if you want to walk with me through more journeys like this, more encounters where wealth and innocence collide, where silence gives way to tears, and where broken hearts find unexpected healing, then subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss what's coming next, and together we'll continue exploring stories that speak not just to the mind, but to the soul. Because at the end of the day, it isn't just my voice telling these stories, it's your presence, your participation, your willingness to reflect and share that keeps this alive. And the truth is, what we're about to step into next may touch you even more deeply, high above. The city, where the windows of the tallest towers reflected the pulse of New York's restless nights, John Mitchell lived in silence. His penthouse was everything that luxury promised. Sleek furniture imported from Italy, paintings worth more than most families would see in a lifetime, and a wine cellar curated as carefully as his financial portfolio. The walls gleamed with success, but the air inside was suffocating, heavy with the weight of absence. Each room, despite its perfection, felt like a museum of things collected to distract from a truth he could no longer run from. The kitchen, with its polished marble counters, hadn't hosted a meal in weeks. The long dining table stood untouched, chairs neatly aligned as though waiting for guests who would never arrive. Even his study, once buzzing with calls, deals and signatures, was reduced to a still life, papers stacked, pens capped, screens dark. To outsiders, John's silence might have looked like composure, but beneath it lived a storm he refused to let anyone see. "Everything feels empty," he whispered once, staring out over the city lights. His voice cracked from disuse, as though speaking itself was a betrayal of the mask he wore. The irony was brutal. A man who had mastered the art of speaking in boardrooms, who could persuade investors and silence rivals with a few precise words, now found himself unable to voice even the simplest admission that he was lost. His silence was not strength, it was surrender, disguised as pride. Across town, only a few subway stops away, stood a building that could not have been more different from John's glittering tower. The orphanage was old, with peeling paint around its windows, and a playground that had seen better days. The laughter of children spilled from its doors like sunlight breaking through cracked blinds. The children had no designer clothes, no polished silverware, no chauffeurs to drive them through the city. Their shoes were worn, their toys shared, and sometimes their meals stretched thinner than they should. Yet in that place there was something John's penthouse could never buy: connection. On Saturday mornings, the sound of a worn-out piano often drifted through the halls as little fingers pressed its keys with clumsy joy. The children's voices rose in imperfect harmony, sometimes too loud, sometimes off-key, but always filled with a raw, unpolished warmth. In the evenings, stories were read aloud on mismatched couches, with kids leaning against each other as if their very closeness was the fabric that held them together. There was no silence here, not the heavy kind John carried. There was noise, laughter, tears, and arguments, but all of it was alive. It was in this contrast, the penthouse of silence against the orphanage of sound, that the stage was quietly being set for a collision. For John, silence had become a prison, one built from grief and reinforced by ego. For the children, noise was freedom, their way of telling the world that they still existed, that despite the losses written into their young lives, they hadn't given up on joy. John would sit by his window late at night, whiskey in hand, staring down at the city that buzzed endlessly without him. He had once been part of that rhythm, an engine in the machine that drove deals, partnerships, and empires. Now he was a shadow, watching from behind glass. "Why does it all feel meaningless?" he muttered one night, the amber liquid trembling in his glass. His reflection in the window looked back at him, not as the confident man he had once been, but as someone hollowed out by the weight of unspoken sorrow. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Ethan, 9 years old, curious eyes always scanning the world, pressed his face to the window to watch the streetlights flicker on at dusk. He didn't know John. He didn't know the story of the man sitting in silence above the city. But Ethan understood loss in a way children shouldn't have to. His parents had been taken in a car accident 2 years before, leaving him with memories that came in flashes. The smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of his father's laughter, the warmth of hugs he could no longer receive. And yet, unlike John, Ethan refused to let silence swallow him. He filled it with questions, laughter, even silly songs he made up on the spot. "Sometimes I think the world is listening," Ethan told another boy at the orphanage one night, lying awake in the shared dorm room. "Like if we laugh loud enough, maybe it'll laugh back." His optimism wasn't naivety, it was defiance. The city didn't know it yet, but these two lives were on a collision course. A millionaire who hid his grief behind skyscraper walls, and a boy who carried his grief openly, but refused to be defined by it. Their meeting would not be planned. It wouldn't be arranged by fate in the dramatic way novels often promise. It would happen quietly, unexpectedly, in a way that revealed just how fragile the boundary is between two worlds that seem so far apart. What made the contrast even sharper was the truth John avoided admitting. Money had never been his real fortress. It was the illusion of control, the idea that if he kept everything in order, meetings scheduled, accounts balanced, investments secured, he could keep chaos out. But chaos had found him anyway, not in the form of bankruptcy or failure, but in the loss of the only person who had seen him beyond the empire. And with her gone, the illusion cracked. The orphanage, by comparison, had no illusions of control. Life there was unpredictable. Some days donations arrived, some days they didn't. Sometimes the heat worked, sometimes it failed. Sometimes a child was adopted, sometimes another was left waiting. And yet through that uncertainty, they learned resilience, not by shutting out the world, but by leaning on each other. Their strength was not polished. It was raw, imperfect, but unshakable. This was the hidden truth of the contrast. John's world was full of everything people chase, money, possessions, recognition, but stripped of connection, it was barren. The children's world was marked by loss, scarcity, and waiting, yet it pulsed with the very thing John lacked, life. And sooner than he expected, that truth would knock on the door of his silence, not with wealth, not with negotiation, but with something disarmingly simple, the touch of a child's hug. For now, though, John stared out at the glittering skyline, unaware that, just a few miles away, a boy named Ethan was asking questions that would one day pierce his silence. The contrast between them grew sharper with every passing day, drawing them closer, preparing the ground for a moment that neither the millionaire nor the child could ever forget. John Mitchell had always been seen as a man of decisions, a man who shaped his own destiny with precision and discipline. In the world of finance, people admired his sharp instincts and relentless drive. They said he had the perfect mindset for business, never wavering, never emotional, never allowing anything to disturb the calculations that made him one of the most respected millionaires in New York. But behind that reputation, a hidden truth was beginning to unravel. For all his control, for all his carefully constructed image, John could not control fate. It happened in a moment, the kind of moment that divides life into a before and an after. His wife, Emily, the woman who had stood beside him through the early days of uncertainty, was gone in an instant. A car accident on a rainy evening, a phone call that shattered the world he thought he could manage. The man who had once believed there was always a solution now faced a loss that offered none. It didn't matter how much money he had, how many doctors he called, how many prayers he whispered into the night. Nothing could bring her back. For weeks after the funeral, John went through the motions like an actor in a play he no longer wanted to be in. He signed documents, nodded at board members, and wore the same tailored suits, but inside he was hollow. The transformation wasn't visible to outsiders at first. To them, he still appeared unshakable, the same man who had conquered every obstacle with logic and determination. But inside, he was broken, carrying a grief so heavy it pressed against his chest every time he tried to breathe. At night, When the city quieted and his penthouse became a glass box above the streets, he would sit in the living room, staring at her empty chair. "Emily," he would whisper, his voice cracking, "how do I keep going without you?" But no answer came, only the hum of the refrigerator, the faint echo of traffic below, and the silence of a space that once carried her laughter. He refused to cry, not because he didn't feel the urge, but because he had been raised to believe that tears were weakness. His father's voice still lingered in his memory, stern and unyielding. "Men don't break. Down, John. Men endure." So he endured. He buried his grief beneath schedules, numbers, and the illusion of progress. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, and the endurance felt like torture. Friends reached out, but he brushed them off. "I'm fine," he would say, forcing a smile. "I just need time." But it wasn't time he needed. It was honesty. The courage to admit he was not fine, that money and power couldn't shield him from the fragility of life. That was the revelation he refused to face, the hidden truth gnawing at him in the quiet hours of the night. Emily had been more than a companion. She had been his balance. Where John was sharp, she was gentle. Where he was calculating, she was intuitive. She reminded him that life was not just about decisions and results, but about the unseen impact of kindness, affection, and vulnerability. Without her, his empire felt like a hollow stage, its wealth reduced to meaningless numbers. One evening, as he sat with a glass of whiskey in hand, he spoke into the empty room as though she were still there. "Do you know what they expect of me? They think I should go back to normal, that I should keep being John Mitchell, the man who never falters. But I can't. I don't even know who I am without you." The words hung in the air, unacknowledged by anyone but himself. The irony was cruel. He had built a life where he controlled outcomes, yet now he couldn't control his own emotions. He thought of Emily's last words to him, that morning before she left the house, simple, ordinary words about dinner plans, and the fact that he never got the chance to respond haunted him more than anything. It was a reminder of how fragile every decision is, how quickly ordinary moments turn into final ones. As the days passed, John's silence grew. He stopped answering calls from old friends, he stopped showing up at social events, and his once commanding voice in the office was replaced by terse nods and signed papers. "Mr. Mitchell, should we move forward with the merger?" one of his executives asked in a meeting. John looked at him blankly for a moment before muttering, "Do whatever you think is best." For the first time, his decisions no longer carried conviction. It wasn't just grief, it was the collapse of an identity. His reputation as unshakable was a mask that no longer fit. He was enduring out of habit, but deep down he wanted to shatter, to scream, to let the world know that even millionaires are not immune to pain. But pride kept him silent. Pride and the fear of what it would mean if others saw him cry. The hidden pain spread into every corner of his life. Meals tasted like nothing. Conversations felt hollow. Even the city he once loved seemed like a stage play performed for someone else's entertainment. He could see the movement, the energy, the ambition, but he no longer felt part of it. And yet, within that silence, there was something else stirring, an unspoken need. A need he didn't dare admit, but one that Emily had always reminded him of. The need for connection, for human closeness, for a touch that spoke louder than words. It was the one thing he could not buy, the one thing he had locked away behind his walls of wealth. That unacknowledged need sat inside him like a wound waiting to be touched, a door waiting to be opened. He didn't know it yet, but the world had already begun setting the pieces in motion. Somewhere not far from his silent tower, a boy named Ethan carried a strength that was not born of money or reputation, but of innocence and resilience. And soon their paths would cross, not with fanfare or warning, but with a simplicity that would change everything John thought he knew about weakness, about healing, and about what it means to be truly strong. It was on an afternoon when the sky hung low over Manhattan, heavy with the kind of grey clouds that made even the city's relentless energy seem muted. that Ethan first saw him. The park was nearly empty, the kind of place where nannies usually pushed strollers or joggers cut through on their routes. But that day, the benches were quiet, and only one man sat there, dressed in an immaculate dark suit that looked almost too polished for such an ordinary place. His shoes gleamed, his tie was perfectly in place, but the way he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, told a different story. His face was angled toward the ground, his hand pressed against his mouth, as if silence was the only thing holding him. Together, Ethan noticed him not because he looked powerful, but because he looked lonely. At 9 years old, Ethan had a way of seeing the things adults tried to hide. Growing up in the orphanage had taught him to read faces, to notice the moments when people smiled but their eyes didn't follow, when they spoke but their voices cracked on the edges. That man on the bench, though, wasn't even trying to hide it. He was the picture of success on the outside, yet everything about his body language spoke of collapse. "Why is he just sitting there?" Ethan whispered to himself as he tugged at the sleeve of his jacket, the fabric a little frayed at the cuff. He had been sent to the park with a group from the orphanage, a rare outing where the children could play in the open air. Some were chasing each other, their laughter bouncing off the trees, while others kicked around a half-deflated soccer ball. But Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the stranger, who didn't look like he belonged in a place filled with running children. There was something about the stillness of the man that pulled at him. Ethan tilted his head, curiosity building. "He looks like he's waiting for someone," he thought. Then, almost as quickly, he wondered if maybe he wasn't waiting at all. Maybe he was hiding. John didn't notice him at first. His thoughts were far away, drifting back to memories of Emily. He could see her laugh in his mind, hear her voice telling him to stop overworking, feel her hand slipping into his when the world became too overwhelming. It was unbearable how sharp the images were. He stared down at the ground, unwilling to let the world see the weight pressing against his chest. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered under his breath, so softly it was almost inaudible. Ethan took a step closer, hesitant but drawn by something he couldn't explain. He wasn't afraid of the man's expensive suit or the way his shoulders seemed to carry authority. To Ethan, he just looked like someone who needed company, and sometimes, when you've lived with loss, you recognize that need in others. "Hi," Ethan said, his voice small but steady. John lifted his head, surprised by the sound. His eyes met the boy's, wide, curious, and innocent. For a moment, John said nothing. The silence between them stretched, heavy, almost as though he was daring Ethan to leave him alone. But Ethan didn't move. He shifted from one foot to the other, then asked, "Why are you sitting by yourself?" It was such a simple question, but it pierced through John like nothing else had. Adults never asked him things like that anymore. They avoided the subject, danced around his pain, treated him like a fragile statue they couldn't afford to crack. But here was a child, unafraid to ask the very thing John had been running from. John's instinct was to retreat, to shield himself with the same armor he used in business meetings. "I just needed some air," he said finally, his voice deeper, rougher than he intended. He hoped it would be enough to end the conversation, but Ethan wasn't deterred. "Do you come here a lot?" he asked, tilting his head like he was trying to solve a puzzle. John looked at him, unsure whether to answer. There was something disarming about the boy's persistence, something honest that made it impossible to dismiss him. "Not really," he admitted. "I don't usually have the time." Ethan smiled faintly, a gap showing where one of his front teeth had fallen out. "I think you do today," he said almost playfully, and for the first time in weeks, John felt the corner of his mouth twitch, though he quickly forced it back into stillness. It was a strange moment. A man who had lost everything that mattered, and a child who had been stripped of the things most people take for granted. Two lives separated by wealth and years, yet connected by an invisible thread neither of them fully understood. John tried to look away, hoping the boy would lose interest, but Ethan stayed. He climbed onto the other end of the bench, swinging his legs because they didn't quite reach the ground. He didn't speak for a while, just sat there like sitting next to John was the most natural thing in the world. Finally, Ethan said softly, "You look sad." The words hung in the air. John felt his throat tighten, his chest constrict. He wanted to deny it, to say something cold or dismissive, but he couldn't bring himself to lie to a child who had asked the question with such purity. "Maybe I am," he whispered, and in that confession, small as it was, something shifted. Ethan didn't judge him, didn't rush to offer empty words. He simply nodded, as though sadness was not a weakness, but a fact of life. It was an acceptance John hadn't received from anyone else, not from his colleagues, not from his friends, not even from himself. The park around them carried on. The children laughed, the wind rustled the leaves, and the city pulsed just beyond the gates. But for John and Ethan, the world seemed to narrow to that single bench, that single moment where silence met innocence. John had no idea that this boy, with nothing to his name but his curiosity and resilience, was about to draw him out of the cage he had built. The contrast was striking, a man who had locked away his grief behind steel and glass, and a child who faced his own losses with openness and courage. That contrast was not just a detail of their meeting, it was the force that would spark the transformation neither of them saw coming. And as John sat there, staring at this boy who refused to leave his side, he felt the faintest stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in far too long, the possibility that connection could still find him, even in the ruins of his silence. John's gaze drifted back to the ground, his jaw tightening, as if silence were the only shield he had left. The boy's presence unsettled him, not because Ethan was intrusive, but because his innocence brushed against the wound John worked so hard to hide. He had spent weeks mastering the art of shutting down, of pushing people away with short nods and empty expressions, and now a child had managed to sit beside him, chipping at the walls without even realizing it. Ethan kicked his feet against the bench, letting them swing with the rhythm only a child could invent. He glanced at John and smiled, his front tooth still missing. "You know," Ethan began, "you look like one of those men from the movies, the ones who have a big secret." John's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. Ethan leaned in a little closer. "Is it true? Do you have a secret?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening together. "I don't talk much," he muttered, the words clipped and heavy. But Ethan didn't give up. He pulled a small candy from his pocket, unwrapped it noisily, and popped it into his mouth. "Well, that's okay," he said between chews. "I talk a lot, so I can do it for both of us." He grinned, waiting for some kind of reaction. When none came, he added, "You should see me at the orphanage. They tell me I never stop." John's chest ached at the word orphanage. It slid under his armor, brushing against the fresh scar of his own loss. He forced his expression to remain still, unwilling to let the boy see the crack in his facade. Silence, he told himself, was safer. But Ethan's energy filled the space regardless. He pulled at the sleeves of his jacket and looked around the park. "This is my favorite place," he said. "Sometimes I come here and pretend the trees are talking to me. They tell me secrets about the city." He turned back to John, eyes gleaming. "Want to hear one?" John kept staring at the ground, unmoved. Ethan leaned in as though sharing classified information. "That tree over there told me the squirrels are spies. They watch us when we're not looking." He giggled, then waited. Surely that joke would break the man's stony face. But John remained silent, the lines on his face carved deep by grief. Inside, though, the joke sparked a memory, Emily laughing at one of her own silly observations. She had once told him pigeons looked like tiny businessmen in grey suits, rushing to invisible meetings. He had laughed then, because her lightness balanced his gravity. Now, hearing Ethan's childish joke, the memory hurt too much to entertain. He stayed quiet, refusing the pull. Ethan frowned, his head tilting slightly. "You don't laugh much, do you?" John's voice finally broke. Through, low and firm. "No." The boy squinted at him as though studying a puzzle. "That's too bad. Laughing makes the air feel lighter." He tapped his chest. "Even in here." John's throat tightened, but he looked away, unwilling to admit how those words cut closer to truth than anything he had heard from adults in weeks. His silence was no longer just avoidance. It was resistance, a battle against the possibility of feeling anything that might undo him. Ethan tried again, undeterred. "Do you—" "Like soccer. We were playing earlier. I scored 2 goals, but one didn't count because the ball went off a tree." He chuckled at his own story. "I still say it should have counted." John stayed unmoved, staring straight ahead, but inside his thoughts churned. He didn't want this. He didn't want a child breaking into his solitude, dragging memories to the surface. He told himself that silence was control, that if he kept his words locked up, he could keep the grief locked up too. But Ethan didn't leave. His presence was persistence in its purest form. No agenda, no calculation, just the natural curiosity of a boy who refused to be ignored. "Do you ever play?" Ethan asked suddenly. John exhaled sharply. "No. Not even when you were a kid?" The question landed heavier than expected. A flash of memory came. John as a boy in Ohio, running across a dusty yard with his brother, a ball bouncing between them, his mother calling out from the porch. It was a memory he hadn't touched in decades, buried under the climb toward success. He shut his eyes for a moment, then forced them open, shaking the image away. "No," he said again, this time harsher. Ethan blinked at him, but instead of retreating, he smiled softly, almost knowingly. "That's okay. Maybe you forgot. Sometimes people forget the good things when the hard things happen." John turned his head sharply toward him, startled by the clarity in such a small voice. He wanted to argue, to push the boy away, but no words came. He clenched his jaw, forcing the silence back into place. The tension thickened. The park felt strangely quiet around them, as if the city itself was waiting to see whether John would finally break. But he didn't. He refused to give the boy more than fragments, because fragments were all he had left to give. And yet something undeniable lingered in the air. Ethan's small talk, his jokes, his persistence, they weren't working in the obvious way, but they were planting cracks in the wall John had built. The millionaire didn't want to admit it, but for the first time since Emily's death, he felt the faintest tremor of disruption inside his fortress of silence. The refusal held, but its strength was weakening. And as the boy sat there, legs swinging and eyes full of patience, the hidden battle inside John grew louder, setting the stage for the moment that would change everything. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The park held that thin, breathless pause that happens right before a decision, the kind that doesn't look like a decision at all from the outside. John stared at the gravel near his shoes, jaw set tight, each muscle in his face fixed like he was clenching against a wave. Ethan watched him, not with the impatience of a child waiting for attention, but with the quiet awareness of someone who recognized a hidden truth. Pain can wear a suit and still be pain. He slid a little closer along the bench, as if he were just adjusting for comfort, but his eyes stayed on. John's face, on the curve of the brow, the unmoving line of the mouth, the way the man's breath came in measured, careful syllables, as though even the air had to be negotiated with. Ethan didn't plan what happened next. He didn't weigh the consequences or calculate the optics the way adults would. He didn't consider the man's watch, or the cut of his jacket, or the strange mismatch of their worlds. He simply stood up on the bench's slats, his sneakers scraping softly against the wood, and he leaned in, small arms reaching, a simple motion born of instinct. He wrapped his arms around John's shoulders and pulled him close in a hug that had no speech attached to it, no agenda, no performance. It wasn't polite, it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't strategic. It was a child's answer to a grown man's silence. For a split second, John froze. His hands hovered, unsure whether to push away or to steady the boy. No one had touched him like that since the funeral. The human contact came like warm rain on a drought-cracked field, uninvited, bewildering, gentle. He felt the slight weight of Ethan's chin settle against his shoulder, the small heartbeat thudding fast through the boy's chest, the faint smell of laundry detergent and the outside air. It hit him with the force of a revelation he didn't want. "This is what you've been starving for and refusing to admit." "I don't," John began, the words scraping like sandpaper. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, not moving. "You don't have to say anything." Something ancient inside John protested. His mindset had been trained on control, on staying upright no matter the weather, on decisions that never allowed him to bend. Hugging back would mean acknowledging how lonely he was. Hugging back would mean the armor had failed, and yet beneath all those rules came a memory, swift and unguarded. Emily's arms around him after a rough day, the way she used to press her cheek to his shoulder and whisper, "You're allowed to be human with me." He had believed her then. The memory cracked open the dry riverbed of his chest, and without permission, a breath stuttered out of him, ragged and real. Ethan didn't tighten the hug or let go. He just stayed, small and steady, as if he understood the impact of stillness. This wasn't the kind of hug people give in lobbies or at holiday parties. It wasn't decorative. It was the kind that tells the truth with touch alone. You're not alone in this, even if it feels like you are. The city sounds blurred. The distant siren, the soft thrum of tires over pavement, a dog's bark a few blocks away. Everything else receded, leaving only the quiet behind-the-scenes movement of two hearts remembering how to be near another person. John's hands finally rose, slow as a reluctant tide, and met the boy's back. The fabric of Ethan's jacket was a little rough beneath his palms. He didn't pull the boy close, not fully, but he didn't push him away either. The decision was microscopic and monumental at the same time. His throat tightened so quickly it startled him. He gulped, blinked hard, tried to steady the line of his mouth. But the body keeps better records than the mind. The first tear surprised him like a betrayal and a mercy at once, hot, unceremonious, unstoppable. He inhaled with a fractured sound, the kind that breaks through whether you want it to or not. I'm fine," he said, the lie too thin to hold. "You don't have to be," Ethan replied, his voice low, almost matter-of-fact. "Sometimes I'm not." There it was, no performance, no pity, just the simple admission of someone who had walked through a similar fire and lost people too. In that shared landscape, the difference in their worlds, penthouse versus dormitory, driver versus bus pass, shrank until it mattered less than what was happening in real time, a man letting a wall loosen by an inch. John pressed his lips together, and the second tear followed the first, then a third, then a line of them that blurred the gravel and the trees and the edges of the world. He didn't sob, not yet. But the defenses he'd kept white-knuckled were failing in the presence of an 8-second hug that stretched into 9, then 10, then 20. The hug landed where motivational quotes and condolences had never reached. It spoke in the oldest language humans know. He dropped his head slightly, eyes closing against the new flood. "I miss her," he whispered, voice shaking. "I miss her so much." Ethan nodded into his shoulder. "I miss them too." The words slipped into John's chest, like keys finding their lock. He pulled back a little, enough to see the boy's face, and for the first time, he really looked. Not at Ethan's jacket, or the missing tooth, or the scuffed sneakers, but at the light behind the eyes, the determined softness of a person who had made a decision about his own pain, not to let it become a cage. That was the hidden truth that came through the boy's presence. Not triumph over sadness, but coexistence with it. Not erasing the past, but allowing the future to have a voice. "What's your name?" John asked, the question arriving like an apology and an opening at once. "Ethan," he said, smiling a little. "What's yours?" "John." The name felt unfamiliar, like introducing a stranger he'd known his whole life. Ethan hopped down from the bench slat and sat next to him again, shoulder brushing shoulder. He didn't pry. He didn't ask the questions adults would ask. He simply breathed, present and unhurried, as though time itself understood the journey they'd just begun. The tension that had coiled around John's ribs loosened by degrees. He wasn't better. He wasn't fixed. But something had shifted. an internal axis tilting by a few degrees, enough to alter direction over distance. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a little embarrassed by the dampness, then exhaled a breath that felt a shade deeper than the ones before. "I don't usually," he began. "Cry?" Ethan finished, but not unkindly. John gave the ghost of a nod. "No. My friend Marcus says crying is like when the sky gets heavy and has to let the water out," Ethan said. "If it didn't, the trees would die." He shrugged, as if this were settled science. "I think he's right." John almost smiled. Almost. The world didn't look brighter, but it looked slightly less hostile, as if the edges had been sanded down a millimeter. He glanced at the boy, then at the field where children chased each other with the certainty that the sun would still set and rise no matter what happened. There was a revelation in that ordinariness he hadn't allowed himself to see. Life had kept moving, and he had been holding his breath in a room with no windows. He cleared his throat. "Do you live nearby?" "At the orphanage around the corner," Ethan said, gesturing with his chin. "We come here a lot. Miss Daniels says the park is good for our brains and our legs." He wiggled his feet. "I think she just likes the quiet." The orphanage again. The word that had cut him earlier now carried a different shade, not pity, not charity, but context. A map of the boy's journey. John followed the direction of Ethan's chin and pictured the building, the chipped paint, the noisy hallways. Somewhere behind those walls were stories not so different from his, etched into small hearts and steady routines. The contrast wasn't a theory anymore. It was seated next to him. Heartbeat against heartbeat earlier, speaking in simple lines that landed cleaner than any boardroom speech. "Do you come here to be alone?" Ethan asked. "I thought I did," John replied, then paused, surprised at his own honesty. "But maybe I came here to remember something I forgot." "What's that?" "That I'm human." Ethan considered it, as if testing the words for balance. "That's a good thing to remember." They sat in companionable silence. A breeze moved through the trees and lifted a few leaves from the ground, sending them into a slow spin that felt almost ceremonial. John watched them, and in the behind the scenes of his own mind, a new mindset began forming, not the glossy kind sold in airport books, but the private, unwritten kind that grows from a single brave moment. He hadn't planned to change. He hadn't chosen transformation. But transformation sometimes chooses you, arriving disguised as a small pair of arms that refuse to accept the armor you've been wearing. "Do you ever feel better after?" John asked suddenly, surprising himself. "After you know." "After I cry?" Ethan said, unbothered by the word. "Yeah, not all at once, but it makes space, like when you clean your room a little. You still miss the stuff that's gone, but there's more room to walk." More room to walk. The phrase found a place to settle. John nodded slowly, like a man learning to speak a language he once knew and had forgotten. He didn't want to rush this or turn it into a lesson he could file away. He wanted to feel it, unedited, without pushing it back into the box, where he had kept everything since Emily's accident. "I didn't think anyone could help," he admitted. "Some things don't need fixing," Ethan said simply. "They need holding." John looked at the boy, really looked, and felt a quiet, seismic shift inside, the kind that would alter future decisions without announcing itself. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he could speak her name in a room full of people or look at the chair in his living room without breaking. But the world had tilted gently, and he could sense the path opening by inches. The park sounds returned to their regular volume, the squeak of a swing's chain, the thud of a ball, the layered conversations of strangers crossing paths. In that ordinary soundtrack, the extraordinary had happened without ceremony. A hug had done what advice couldn't. A child had offered a form of strength that didn't look like strength, and yet was the strongest thing in the world. Ethan slid off the bench and stood facing John, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "Are you going to be here again?" he asked, a question that felt both casual and important. "I don't know," John said, then revised it, hearing the new honesty in his own voice. "Maybe I should." "Okay," Ethan said, satisfied. "I'll probably be around. I'm good at finding people." John huffed a small breath that almost counted as a laugh. "I can see that." They began walking toward the gate together, not touching now, just matching each other's steps in a rhythm that felt unforced. The city waited on the other side, its noise, its tasks, its expectations. But John felt the impact of the bench still in his bones, the imprint of where Ethan's arms had been. He didn't feel cured, he felt opened, and sometimes opened is the only bridge you need to reach the next shoreline. As they reached the path where the park spilled back into the street, Ethan pointed with his chin again, toward a brick building a block away, its windows crowded with paper cutouts and crayon art. "That's us," he said. "We do pizza Fridays when we can, and movie nights when Miss Daniels finds the good DVDs." John followed the gesture, the building sharpening into focus like a photo coming clear. Stories lived in there, messy ones, honest ones, the kind Emily loved because they were unpolished and real. He thought of the chair in his living room, of the echo that haunted it, and then of this new room he hadn't entered yet, noisy and imperfect and alive. The contrast no longer felt like distance, it felt like a map. He looked down at Ethan. "Thank you," he said, the two words delivered with the weight of everything he couldn't say yet. Ethan nodded once, as if thanks were unnecessary for something as obvious as a hug. "See you, John." The boy trotted toward the orphanage, his steps light, a small silhouette against the brick. John remained at the corner, hands in his pockets, letting the city fold around him. The urge to retreat back into the old script tugged. At him, the schedule, the meetings, the sterile safety of doing rather than feeling. But something quieter tugged too, asking for a different kind of courage. He didn't have answers, and he didn't need speeches. He had a doorway now, and on the other side of it waited the next part of this journey, where a man who had been silent might learn what to do with a voice he wasn't sure he could trust yet. John stood at the corner long after Ethan disappeared into the brick building, as if the air itself were asking him a question he didn't know how to answer. The traffic light cycled from red to green and back again, the city moving in practiced rhythms, while he felt offbeat, slightly out of phase with everything. He didn't make a big decision. It was smaller than that, a nudge from someplace quiet. He turned toward home, not like a man retreating, but like someone returning to the scene of an unfinished conversation. The hug had not healed him, and he didn't pretend it had, but it had. Changed the texture of the silence inside him. It wasn't clean anymore. It held an interruption, a soft insistence that wouldn't let him pass by his own heart without noticing it. In the elevator to the penthouse, he watched his reflection in the chrome paneling, noting the salt line at the corner of his jaw, where a tear had dried. He rubbed it away with his thumb, surprised by the intimacy of the gesture. He hadn't touched his own face with that kind of tenderness in months. The doors opened. Onto the foyer, with the familiar hush he'd once found luxurious. Tonight it sounded like a withheld breath. He dropped his keys in the tray, the clink too loud for the room. The view of Manhattan stretched past the glass like a promise he couldn't cash. He removed his jacket and laid it over a chair with exaggerated care, as though roughness might set off an alarm. The apartment wore Emily everywhere, subtle, unannounced. A book she had been reading still marked at chapter 7. A scarf on the arm of the couch, the faint thread of her perfume so light he might have imagined it if it hadn't stopped him mid-step. The living room chair remained angled to catch the morning sun, a habit she loved. He had ignored that chair like a superstition, refusing to move it, refusing to sit in it, treating it like some small shrine built on a decision not to decide. He walked toward it now without meaning to, drawn by an invisible line in the air. He stood there, hands loose at his sides. "I saw a kid today," he said to the empty room, and the sound startled him because he wasn't used to narrating anything out loud anymore. "His name's Ethan." The name felt gentle in his mouth. He set a palm on the chair's back. The leather was cool under his skin. A careful inhale, a careful exhale, the practiced mindset of a man trained to regulate everything. But grief is not a market. It does not respond to pressure or forecasts. In the behind-the-scenes workings of his body, something he couldn't negotiate with had already been set in motion. The hug had left fingerprints that no cloth could polish away. He stepped back, steady, then reached for the scarf without thinking. The fabric slipped over his wrist like wind. "You would have liked him," he murmured. He moved into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, and took down a glass with mechanical precision. The first pour of water missed the center by a fraction, tapping the rim with a sound that felt like a tiny fracture. He remembered Emily, tapping his knuckle once when he'd poured coffee too high. "Leave room for life," she'd joked. He could hear her voice so clearly that the present thinned, and the past shone through like a slide on a projector. He set the glass down, pushing it away as if distance could dilute the memory. Without meaning to, he touched the countertop, where she used to lean with the heel of her hand while telling him a story about some stranger on the subway who had restored her faith in people. She fed on. Stories the way he fed on numbers. Together, they had balanced the ledger. He returned to the living room, and the chair pulled at him again, not a command, more like gravity. He sat. The cushions gave with a softness that knocked something loose. He set the scarf in his lap and stared out the window at a city pretending not to know him. "You're allowed to be human with me." The sentence from memory threaded into the present like a seam. "I'm trying," he whispered. "Emily, I'm trying." The name tore on the way out. His chest tightened, a hot band forming where breath should have gone. He straightened automatically, shoulders squared as if posture could hold him together. But grief had learned his strategies. It had watched him line up his defenses for weeks and simply waited for a decision that would tilt the ground. Ethan's arms had been that decision. He stood abruptly, as if motion could outrun feeling, and crossed to his study. The room greeted him with familiarity, lined shelves, the desk where he signed deals that shaped other people's lives. He tugged open a drawer for a pen, then stopped. Her handwriting stared back from a small stack of sticky notes, grocery items jotted in loops and curves he knew by heart. He didn't pick one up. He didn't have to. The sight was enough to unlatch the door he'd been bracing his weight against. "I can't do this," he said, the sentence falling out in a voice he barely recognized. His shoulders trembled first, a fine shiver that might have passed if he'd forced his breath into deeper, steadier lanes. He tried, he failed. A breath hitched, another broke mid-inhale. He grabbed the edge of the desk and closed his eyes as if darkness could hold the pieces together. But the body is honest, where the mind is stubborn. The shut door swung inward quietly at first, then with the refusal of a tide. His face collapsed. The muscles gave up their choreography. He folded, knees softening as if he'd been checked in a game he didn't see. Coming. The first sound that left him was not dramatic, it was small, a surprise noise a person makes when something too hot touches skin. The second was lower, traveling up from under the ribs where he'd stored the weight. Tears came hard, uncoordinated, an ungentle weather. He pressed the heel of his hand to his mouth, then dropped it because the pressure made it worse. "Emily," he said, and the name became water. "Emily, I don't know how." He was not dignified. His breath stuttered in uneven parcels, chest staccato against the rhythm he'd enforced for weeks. The tears didn't pause to ask permission or to consider how a man like him should cry. They did their work with indifferent mercy, washing, salting, exposing. Years of iron habit, don't break, don't bend, don't show, met a revelation he couldn't outthink. Love leaves a shape that grief can't pretend isn't there. He sank to the floor beside the desk, palms flat against the wood as if grounding could keep him from tipping. In the blur of sound, he heard fragments of her laugh, the clink of her teaspoon, the whisper of a book page turning. The ordinary came back sharper than the milestones, and that was its own cruelty. "I miss your mess," he said through the tears. The sentence absurd and truer than any speech he'd given in a decade. "I miss your shoes by the door. I miss your half-finished stories." He closed his eyes and let the flood crest over him. Somewhere deep down he realized the breaking point wasn't a dramatic cliff. It was a series of small, unglamorous collapses that finally linked hands. He didn't time it. He didn't monitor it. He let it happen the way storms happen, arriving, doing their necessary damage, leaving the air rinsed and altered. When the wave pulled back, it didn't leave calm. It left space. His breathing found a slower path, like traffic unclogging block by block. He leaned his head against the side of the desk and stared at the lower panel as if it were a horizon. The room, it felt different by a few degrees, and those degrees mattered. The hidden truth he had protected, "If I cry, I'll never stop," proved false in the way so many fear-built predictions do. He had cried, and the world had not ended. The world had made room. He stood unsteadily and went to the sink to splash water on his face. The mirror returned a man he recognized and didn't. Eyes red-rimmed, yes, but softer. The jaw unclenched. The brow not so fiercely recruited for war. He pressed both hands to the counter and let the cold porcelain steady him. "I'm not okay," he said to his reflection. And to his surprise, the admission didn't feel like surrender. It felt like fence posts being moved back to make room for a garden. His decisions, he realized, had been shaped by a single outdated rule. Pain must be hidden to be survived. The rule had been useful once, maybe, but it didn't fit the landscape anymore. Ethan's hug had issued a quiet correction. He drifted back to the living room, aware of a new, tentative readiness in his body, a permission to exist without the constant audit of every feeling. He reached for his phone, not to call a colleague or cancel a meeting, but to open a voice message he'd never had the courage to play. Emily, laughing in the middle of a sentence, telling him she'd found the perfect lamp for the hallway and that he'd hate it at first and love it later. He listened. He cried again, gentler this time, tears moving like a soft current rather than a flood. "I love you," he whispered to no one and to her. "I love you, and I don't know how to do this, but I'm here." He set the phone down and stood in the window's wash of city light. The skyline looked less like a monolith and more like a map. Streets to walk, corners to turn, places where a boy might be kicking a ball against a tree that didn't count as a goal. The impact of that bench moment continued to hum in his ribcage, a new frequency he couldn't unhear. He wasn't making plans yet. The journey didn't need plans tonight. It needed one steady step that honored what had broken without pretending to fix it. He glanced at the scarf on the chair and understood, with the quiet certainty of a revelation that arrives once and stays, that strength was not the absence of tears, but the willingness to let them tell the truth. He picked up the scarf and draped it over the back of the chair, the way she used to when she was too busy talking to put things away properly. The gesture felt like lighting a porch. Lamp, a small welcome for a version of himself that had been standing outside in the dark. He inhaled, a full breath this time, and the air met him halfway. "Ethan," he said aloud, testing the name in the room as if introducing two friends. The boy's patience, the uncomplicated mercy of that hug, the mindset of a child who believed in small repairs. These weren't footnotes. They were a path. The city's evening deepened. Somewhere below, a siren rose and fell, a reminder that life was always happening in the plural. John slipped his hands into his pockets and felt, to his surprise, a thin thread of anticipation stitched through the sadness. Not the bright, relentless eagerness he used to chase, but something humbler, a readiness to see what else the day might hand him if he didn't look away. Tears had not solved him. They had softened him enough to be reachable. That was the difference. That was the point. He turned from the window and let his eyes rest on the ordinary objects that had terrified him, the chair, the book, the scarf, and noticed how they asked less of him now that he'd let them say what they had to say. The refusal had cracked. The mask had given. What stood there was no longer a statue the city bowed to, but a person capable of hearing a small voice on a park bench and answering it. He didn't script the next move. He didn't declare a new chapter. He simply allowed the apartment to hold him with its imperfect chorus of echoes. And in that permission, a direction began to draw itself. Thin, luminous, leading from a quiet chair toward a door that would soon open on a room full of mismatched couches, a worn piano, and a boy who believed there is more room to walk after you make space for rain. The city outside kept moving in its usual rhythm, neon lights flickering to life as dusk painted the sky with deeper blues. But inside John's penthouse, the air held a different weight. He sat in the chair he once feared, scarf draped where Emily had left it. The silence around him no longer an enemy, but a companion that invited honesty instead of punishment. The memory of the boy's hug was still alive on his skin, warm and stubborn, a presence that wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the gesture itself. It was the strange certainty that the boy had understood something adults had failed to see. John leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and whispered to himself, how did he know? He didn't realize he had fallen asleep until the early morning light nudged him awake. The apartment felt gentler in the soft wash of dawn, but his chest still carried the dull ache that sleep never erased. He rose, poured coffee into a mug Emily had once claimed as her own, and found his thoughts circling back to Ethan. It wasn't just curiosity, it was the pull of recognition, as though that boy's persistence had held up a mirror John hadn't looked into in years. He remembered the boy's words echoing in fragments. Laughter makes the air lighter. Sometimes people forget the good things. And now those fragments demanded more space than the usual static of numbers and headlines. Later that day, as if drawn by some invisible current, John found himself back at the park. He didn't plan it. His driver wasn't waiting. There was no schedule attached. He walked, hands in his pockets, and the sound of children playing reached him before the gates came into view. Ethan was there, running after a ball, tripping once and laughing at himself, then straightening with the resilience only children seem to carry so easily. John stopped at the edge of the path, half hidden by the shade of a tree, unsure if he should intrude. He was used to environments where he was expected, where his presence commanded attention. Here, he was anonymous, an outsider watching a world that operated without him. Ethan noticed him anyway. He jogged over, face bright, and without hesitation plopped down on the bench beside him, as if no time had passed. "You came back," Ethan said. Out of breath, but smiling wide, John nodded slightly. "I did." The boy leaned back, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "I knew you would. You looked like you needed the park more than I did." John allowed a faint exhale that almost counted as a laugh. "You're very sure of yourself." "Not really," Ethan replied, shrugging. "I just know when someone's sad. It's kind of my thing." The sentence lingered, heavier than its casual tone suggested. John turned his head toward him, caught by the quiet authority in a 9-year-old's words. "Why do you say that?" Ethan hesitated for the first time since they'd met, his legs swinging slowly under the bench. His voice dropped to a whisper, as if the confession were too fragile to say out loud in the full noise of the park. "Because I lost my parents, too." The words landed like a stone in water, rippling outward, breaking through John's practiced composure with a force he hadn't braced for. His chest tightened, not from resistance, but from recognition. He turned away, staring at the children in the distance, giving the boy the space to continue if he wanted. "It was 2 years ago," Ethan said softly, eyes fixed on his sneakers. "A car accident. 1 minute they were here and the next, they weren't." He swallowed hard, the innocence in his voice sharpening with a pain far older than his years. "I didn't talk for a long time after that. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe I could still hear them. But it didn't work. The quiet just made it worse." John's throat burned as he listened. The boy wasn't telling him this to gain sympathy, to earn points, or to seek comfort. He was sharing because he recognized the wound in someone else. The realization cracked something deeper than grief. It dismantled the illusion that John's pain was unique, that his silence set him apart. Here was a child, stripped of everything, yet brave enough to carry his loss out in the open where the world could see it. Ethan lifted his head, meeting John's gaze with a steady sincerity that cut past all pretense. "But then I figured something out." Hugs. They kind of keep them alive. At least for me. Every time someone hugs me, I remember how my mom used to. It makes me feel like she's not completely gone. Like she left a piece of herself behind. The boy's words wrapped around John tighter than the hug itself had. He felt his shoulders tremble, the thin line of self-control stretching toward collapse again. Tears pressed at the edges of his eyes, but this time he didn't fight them with the same ferocity. The hidden truth was too clear. He wasn't sitting with a child who pitied him. He was sitting with someone who shared the same wound, carried differently, but with equal weight. John lowered his face into his hands, the scarf of memory and the rawness of present pain intertwining until he couldn't separate them. His shoulders began to shake, not in neat intervals, but in the broken rhythm of someone finally surrendering. He wept, not as a millionaire in a suit, not as a man protecting an image, but as a human being stripped bare of armor. The sound of his crying blended with the background noise of the park, unremarkable to strangers, but monumental in his own body. Ethan rested a hand on his arm, small but steady. "It's okay," he whispered. "You don't have to be strong all the time. Nobody does." John lifted his head, his face blotched and wet, and looked at Ethan with an expression he hadn't worn in years. Raw, vulnerable, without performance. "I miss her so much," he said, the words tumbling out like stones from a crumbling wall. Ethan nodded slowly, his voice firm despite the softness of his age. "I miss them too. But missing means they mattered, right? It means we still carry them." That sentence carved itself into John's heart, not like a wound, but like a compass pointing to a truth he had refused to admit. He wasn't broken because he was grieving. He was broken because he had tried to grieve. Alone. And here was a boy, 9 years old, offering him the lesson that connection is not weakness, it's survival. The tears didn't stop right away. They came in waves, uncoordinated and messy, until his body began to exhaust itself into a quieter rhythm. His breathing steadied, though each inhale still trembled on the way in. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed for a moment until he saw Ethan watching him with unflinching acceptance. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" John asked quietly, his voice thin. "It's waking up and realizing I can't tell her the little things, the small stuff. That's what hurts most." Ethan's brow furrowed in understanding. "Yeah, I used to want to tell my dad about every soccer game. I still do sometimes, so I just tell him anyway, out loud, even if he can't answer." John considered the boy's words, realizing with a kind of quiet awe that he was being shown a new mindset, one unpolished and raw, but undeniably true. This wasn't about erasing the loss. It was about keeping the thread alive in small ways, ways that didn't require permission or validation. The revelation came not from a therapist, a book, or a polished speech, but from a child who had learned to survive the same kind of absence. The park seemed brighter when John finally looked up again, not because the sun had shifted, but because his perspective had. He saw the children running, the trees swaying, the ordinary movement of life carrying on, and instead of feeling alienated from it, he felt the faint pull of belonging. The wound was still there, deep and raw, but it wasn't solitary anymore. Ethan had reached across the gap with nothing more than honesty and a hug, and that had changed everything. They sat side by side, quiet now, but the silence was no longer suffocating. It held recognition, a shared weight that didn't feel quite as unbearable because it was being carried by two. John straightened slightly, his breathing slow, and let his gaze follow the boy's small frame beside him. He didn't know yet what would come of this connection, but he sensed it mattered more than anything he had faced in boardrooms or contracts. The millionaire and the orphan, linked by loss, had stumbled into the kind of truth that doesn't arrive with announcements, but with whispers. And as the minutes passed, the fragile bond between them began to feel less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a journey neither of them had expected, one where wounds didn't vanish, but transformed into bridges, leading somewhere entirely new. The park bench had become their meeting place. The quiet stage where something fragile yet unshakable was unfolding between a man who had lost everything he thought defined him and a boy who carried his own loss with disarming honesty. But the story didn't stop there. For John, the encounter was not a single spark destined to fade. It was the beginning of a transformation that reached into places of his life he had locked away. The following week, his steps carried him back toward the orphanage. It wasn't planned in his calendar, wasn't penciled in between meetings or calls. It was an impulse, but not the reckless kind, more like a compass nudging him in a direction he didn't fully understand yet. He approached the building cautiously, the chipped bricks and faded paint standing in stark contrast to the polished marble he was accustomed to. Through the open windows he heard laughter spilling out, messy and loud, the kind that belonged to children who hadn't yet learned to measure their joy. He paused at the door, unsure if he belonged in such a space, until Ethan spotted him from across the room. "You came!" the boy shouted, weaving through a cluster of kids before throwing his arms around John's waist. The simplicity of the welcome dissolved any hesitation. John cleared his throat, still adjusting to the unfamiliar rhythm of this world. "I wasn't sure if it was appropriate." Ethan grinned. "Miss Daniels says visitors are good, especially ones who don't bring homework." Miss Daniels herself appeared, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that had seen too many hard truths yet still managed to shine. She shook John's hand without ceremony. "If you're here to see the kids, that's enough. We can always use another grown-up willing to listen." Listen. The word rang louder than it should have. John had spent decades being the one who spoke, the one others listened to, the one whose decisions echoed through boardrooms and stock markets. But here, listening was the currency, and it was one he hadn't traded in for years. He sat with the children that afternoon, at first feeling as out of place as a suit at a playground. Yet the longer he stayed, the more the edges softened. A girl named Lily asked him to read from a picture book, her small hand resting on his sleeve as though she trusted him without question. Another boy challenged him to a game of checkers, and when John lost badly, the room erupted in laughter that somehow included him rather than mocked him. Ethan stayed close, watching with a mixture of pride and relief. "See," he said quietly, "you're not that scary." "I thought I was," John admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "You just needed practice," Ethan replied, shrugging as if it were the simplest truth in the world. And so it began. The visits became regular, not forced, not scheduled, but expected in the quiet way habits form. John found himself drawn back to the orphanage again and again, each time leaving with a little more lightness in his chest. He wasn't telling stories of mergers or investments. He was listening to tales of playground victories, of scraped knees, of dreams about growing up to be astronauts or firefighters. And when the children asked about his own childhood, he found himself speaking, not of wealth or empire, but of his brother, of running across dusty fields in Ohio, of fishing trips with his father where patience was the only rule. Memories he had buried under ambition now rose like old friends, unpolished but real. It startled him at first, how easy the words came when the audience didn't care about his net worth. One afternoon, after telling the kids about a dog he once had named Cooper, he paused and realized, "I haven't spoken this freely in years." He looked at Ethan, who was watching him intently, and the boy simply nodded as if to say, "This is the you I knew was hiding." With each visit, John began to notice small transformations inside himself. The sharpness in his tone softened. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter, not because the grief had vanished, but because it no longer carried the illusion of being his alone. He began laughing again, awkwardly at first, then fully, the sound startling even him. It wasn't polished laughter meant to impress at a gala. It was unfiltered, the kind that came from watching Ethan try to balance 3 cookies in one hand and fail spectacularly. Miss Daniels noticed the change too. One evening, as John helped clean up after dinner, she placed a hand on his arm. "You know, Mr. Mitchell, the kids don't see you as a millionaire. They just see you as someone who shows up. And that's worth more here than any check you could write. The words hit him harder than any praise he'd received in his career. For so long, his value had been measured in numbers and influence, but here it was measured in presence, in time, in the willingness to kneel on the floor and help a child build a puzzle. It was a revelation disguised in the ordinary, a behind-the-scenes truth he'd ignored while chasing validation from the world. One evening, after a long day at the orphanage, John walked home under the fading light. He passed skyscrapers that once made him feel powerful, but now they seemed almost absurdly hollow. He realized with clarity that true wealth had nothing to do with glass towers or the size of his accounts. It was in the connections being forged in that brick building, in the laughter of children who had lost much but still dared to dream, and in the small hand of a boy who had reminded him how to cry. He sat in his penthouse that night, the skyline glowing beyond the windows, and for the first time in months he spoke out loud, without hesitation. "I miss you, Emily," he said, voice steady, no longer breaking at the edges. "But I think I'm learning how to live with it." The scarf still lay across the chair, but now it looked less like a monument and more like a memory carried forward. He wasn't healed, not completely, but healing had begun to feel less like an impossible mountain and more like a journey he had already taken the first steps on. Ethan had taught him something his millions never could. Silence and pride only built prisons, but connection, messy, vulnerable, unpredictable, was the key to stepping outside the walls. Days blurred into weeks, and the rhythm of John's life began to shift. Mornings, once filled with spreadsheets and conference calls, now sometimes started with pancakes at the orphanage, his tie swapped for rolled-up sleeves as he poured syrup for a group of children arguing about cartoons. Evenings were spent not in sterile meetings, but in games of tag, where his expensive shoes gathered dust and his laughter startled the night. The transformation wasn't theatrical. It was gradual, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to John, it was seismic. He had gone from a man who couldn't speak for fear of breaking to a man who now spoke about hope, about resilience, about the beauty of carrying scars without shame. He didn't stand on stages or deliver speeches. He shared at dinner tables, on park benches, in whispered conversations with children who believed in him, not because of his past, but because of his presence. One evening, after story time at the orphanage, Ethan tugged at his sleeve. "You're different now," the boy said matter-of-factly. John smiled, faintly, crouching so they were eye to eye. "Maybe I am." "Not maybe," Ethan insisted. "You laugh more, and you talk about her. That means she's still here." The boy's certainty filled John's chest with something close to peace. "Thank you, Ethan," he said softly. "For what?" "For reminding me what matters." The words hung between them, simple yet undeniable. And in that moment John understood. The greatest wealth he had ever known was not measured in accounts or accolades, but in the shared humanity of a child's touch, a child's honesty, a child's unshakable belief that broken hearts could still carry love forward. And as the night settled over the city, the man who had once refused to speak found his voice again. Not the voice of power, but the voice of connection, of laughter, of hope, and that voice was leading him somewhere he had never expected to go. The shift didn't announce itself with fireworks. It unfolded in quiet increments that only become visible when you look back and trace the line. John noticed it first in the mornings, in the way he no longer dreaded the sound of his own footsteps. He would pause by the window, coffee warm in his hand, and let the city's hum meet him without the old defensiveness. The penthouse hadn't changed, but his relationship to it had. He stopped treating the rooms like a museum and started treating them like a home with a memory. He let the chair stay in the sun, not as a monument to absence, but as proof that light still finds its way to the places it once loved. He didn't rush this understanding. It arrived the way low tide exposes the contours of a shoreline, revealing what had been there all along. The transformation he was living was not a thunderclap. It was the rhythm of a heart relearning trust, a mindset shifting from control to connection, from performance to presence. He carried that rhythm into the orphanage, where the day-to-day was a kind of honest chaos. In the behind-the-scenes of those afternoons, spilled juice, crayons rolling under tables, the piano keys that stuck on C-sharp, he discovered a structure more durable than the schedules he once worshipped. Kids tugged at his sleeves not because he could open doors in the city, but because he could open the box of puzzles, because he would laugh when someone accidentally wore two left shoes, because he didn't mind being the tower in a game that required him to be knocked down and rebuilt. One afternoon, a storm cut the power, and the room slipped into a blue-grey dusk. The children huddled together on the floor with flashlights, while Miss Daniels told a ghost story that wasn't scary at all. When lightning cracked and a small boy flinched, John said quietly, "Want to sit here?" The child nodded, scooted closer, and leaned into him like it was the most natural decision in the world. It felt like a tiny revelation. The impact you have is rarely where you expect it. It's in the seat you offer when the lights go out. He found himself speaking. More, but not with the old cadence of authority. When Ethan asked about his childhood, he let the memories unspool without polishing them. "My brother and I used to race bikes down a hill that felt like a mountain," he said one day, chuckling. "We thought we were invincible until we hit gravel." Ethan laughed and answered, "I bet you still won." John shrugged. Sometimes. Sometimes it was enough to just get back up. The truth of that line stayed with him long after the laughter faded. It wasn't a slogan. It was a map of survival. Later, washing dishes, while the kids argued about whether pancakes were better than waffles, Miss Daniels watched him with the patient smile of someone witnessing a decision being made over time rather than in a single moment. At night, he walked home, not as the man who towers over the city, but as a man who now belongs to corners and doorways and voices calling his name. He would pass a bar where two friends argued about baseball and feel the small, surprising urge to care who won. He would watch strangers share an umbrella and think almost involuntarily, "There's a lesson in that," and then laugh at himself for being the sort of person who sees metaphors in weather. Yet there was a hidden truth to those small observations. He was paying attention again. Grief had narrowed his vision to a single point. Connection widened it, let the periphery come back into focus. The world didn't feel hostile at that distance. It felt reachable. He kept talking to Emily, not out loud in elevators or on busy sidewalks, but in the spaces where silence is generous. "You'd like these kids," he'd say, setting his keys in the tray. "Ethan thinks squirrels are spies." He would catch himself smiling and realize that memory, when shared, doesn't only ache, it also illuminates. "I heard your voice today," he told her one evening, standing by the chair, in someone else's laughter. The admission didn't break him. It grounded him, turned longing from a cliff edge into a shoreline he could walk without falling off the world. Ethan became the axis around which many of these new orbits formed. The boy's curiosity never dulled. If anything, it sharpened into a kind of wisdom that didn't need big words. "Do you think grown-ups forget how to play on purpose?" he asked once, slinging a backpack over one shoulder like a comic book hero. John answered without thinking, "I think some of us forget as a way to prove we're in charge." Ethan nodded as if this matched a hypothesis he'd been testing. "But you can be in charge and still be fun," the boy declared, then tapped John's arm. "I've seen it." It was hard to argue with a witness. The boardroom version of John still existed. He hadn't vanished into story time. But even there, in the tall glass rooms where success was usually measured in lines on a chart, he began to notice the places where empathy can do work that strategy cannot. He didn't announce the change. He simply asked better questions. "What are we not seeing here?" he'd say to a team stuck in numeric loops. "What's the human cost if we get this wrong?" A colleague pulled him aside after a meeting and said, half teasing, half reverent, "You're different. It's like you're looking through people instead of at them." John smiled slightly. "Maybe I finally learned where to look." He didn't try to explain Ethan, or the orphanage, or the park bench. He didn't turn the experience into a pitch deck. Some revelations don't belong on slides. They belong in the space between two people who trust each other. He also learned that transformation asks something of you beyond insight. It asks practice. So he practiced. When the ache crested, he didn't exile it. He made a chair for it and let it sit down. When an old habit tried to reclaim the room, silence, retreat, pride, he noticed it the way you notice an old song playing in the background. "I know you," he'd think, "but I'm busy." He allowed himself small rituals that tethered tenderness to action. He bought a second-hand softball glove and took it to the orphanage on Saturdays. He kept a notebook by the door and wrote down the funny things the kids said so he could tell Emily later, which turned out to be another way of telling himself. He repaired a loose shelf in the library with a patience he wouldn't have recognized 6 months earlier and understood, kneeling there with a screwdriver, that repairing the visible is sometimes a rehearsal for repairing the unseen. One afternoon, the piano in the common room broke mid-song. The D key stuck, and a chorus of groans rose from the kids as if the universe had betrayed them. John knelt, squinted into the old instrument, and found the tiny obstruction, a crayon someone had dropped through the back. He pried it out. The key sprang free, and the room erupted in applause like he'd resurrected a cathedral. Ethan leaned close and whispered, grinning, "You're pretty good at fixing stuff." John whispered back, "Only the easy things." The answer made them both smile, and yet it carried a second life inside it. He knew the hard repairs weren't his alone to do. He had help now. That was the point. The conversations with Ethan continued to puncture the old narrative that strength equals isolation. "Do you think they can hear us?" Ethan asked one evening, the two of them watching the sunset paint the orphanage windows orange. John exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he said, letting uncertainty be a bridge rather than a wall. "But I think love is loud. It gets through." Ethan nodded, satisfied. "Then we should keep talking." That line anchored itself in John's chest. He began to understand that hope is not a mood, but a practice, a decision you make on days when it feels optional and on days when it doesn't. Miss Daniels watched this slow rewiring with a scholar's interest and a mother's gratitude. "You know what they get from you?" she asked him quietly as they stacked chairs. John shook his head, prepared to deflect the compliment she was building. "Consistency," she said. "You arrive. That's rare for them. It recalibrates a child's nervous system when someone arrives on purpose." He held the chair a beat longer than he needed to, hearing the sentence settle where it mattered. He didn't answer with a speech. He answered by marking the next Saturday on a paper calendar he kept in the kitchen now, old-fashioned and visible, because some commitments deserve ink. He found courage in small increments. He lowered his voice at the right moments and raised it when someone else needed his volume. He put his phone away during dinner. He said, "I don't know," in rooms that rewarded certainty, and discovered that honesty can move a conversation forward faster than pretense. He walked past the old milestones, quarterly reports, glossy events, the polite theatre of applause, and recognized them as props from a life that no longer needed that set. He wasn't against ambition. He was simply for something bigger than it. Connection had changed the metric, a different ledger balanced now. On a rain-cleared morning, he and Ethan cut across the park, the grass bright as if it had been washed overnight. "I had a dream," Ethan announced, skipping a step. "We were astronauts. We fixed a satellite together." John raised an eyebrow. "What was wrong with it?" Ethan considered. "It forgot how to talk to Earth." John let the line hang, delivered with a child's unself-conscious wisdom, and answered, "Then it's a good thing. We were there." The exchange wasn't profound on paper, but inside it lived the whole story, a man and a child, re-establishing signal, reminding themselves that silence is sometimes the symptom, not the cure. At home, the voice message of Emily's laughter remained a liturgy he didn't hide from. He played it on days he felt steady, and on days he didn't, understanding that memory is a bridge you can walk in both directions. He didn't apologize for the tears that followed, and he didn't force them either. He simply let them perform their limited and beautiful work. "I'm learning, Em," he said once into the room. The city spread behind him like a living postcard. Not fast, but true. Saying it out loud didn't feel like pretending she could hear. It felt like telling himself the truth in a way his body could accept. Little by little, the people around him began to read the change, not as a phase, but as a recalibration. A doorman who had known him for years said, "You look lighter, Mr. Mitchell." John smiled. "Maybe I am." A colleague who had always kept their distance began staying after meetings to tell him about a son who struggled to sleep. John listened, not because he now had the right words, but because he finally had the right attention. A neighbor who had once complained about the elevator music asked him, unprompted, if he knew any good volunteer programs for teens. He wrote down 2 and thought of the strange way generosity echoes. How a single, authentic adjustment can reverberate down a hallway of lives without needing credit. He also permitted himself quiet retreats into the park alone, not to hide, but to trace the path back to where the new chapter had opened. He would sit with the memory of a bench and a boy and feel gratitude arrive like a tide he didn't command. Gratitude, he discovered, is another form of strength. It makes the tender parts of you sturdy. He stopped demanding that meaning show up as certainty and let it show up as companionship, as a hand on a shoulder, as a joke about squirrels. That simplicity did not trivialize his pain. It domesticated it, taught it to coexist with light. "Do you think I'll forget them?" Ethan asked one evening as clouds gathered like folded blankets over the skyline. John shook his head. "I think love is like handwriting. Once it's on you, you can always recognize it." Ethan studied his palm as if the letters were visible there. "Then I'm okay," he decided. John nodded, feeling the decision resonate in places that used to echo, "You are." He thought about all the decisions that had led him here, the glamorous ones and the invisible ones, and realized that some choices remake you in silence. You say yes to a visit, yes to a story, yes to a hug, and the yes keeps going long after the moment is over, shaping your posture toward the world. The hidden truth he'd been avoiding now sat with him at the table. His life wasn't waiting to restart after grief. It was continuing inside of it, like a river, moving around a rock, reshaping the shore a little more each day. When the city's nightlights stitched themselves across the dark again, he felt the urge to put words around the journey. Not to contain it, but to honor it. He didn't draft an email or make a speech. He let the words come as a voiceover in his mind, the kind you hear when your heart is quiet enough to narrate what it recognizes. Sometimes the greatest power isn't money, but the courage to cry, to feel, to be human. The sentence didn't argue with his past. It blessed it for getting him this far and invited him forward. He stood, ready to return to the orphanage the next day, with a half-repaired kite and a story about gravel and bikes. And as he reached for the door, he caught the mild electric sense that life had more turns prepared than he could currently see. The pattern had already taught him that surprises rarely arrive with trumpets. They walk in wearing ordinary shoes, asking ordinary questions, changing everything by degrees until the map looks new. And this wasn't the last time John's life would be changed by a child. There's another moment waiting in the story ahead. And if you've stayed with me until this point, it probably means something in this story spoke to you too. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when life surprised you, or maybe it simply made you pause for a breath you didn't know you needed. If that's the case, let me know down in the comments. Write something like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me, so I know you were here, walking through this journey with me. And while you're here, Give this video a like. It helps keep these stories alive and reaching more people who might need them. If you want to keep following along, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Each story builds on the last, always circling back to what really matters: connection, resilience, and the quiet power of being human. And since you've already come this far with me, don't stop now. There's a video right here that carries this same thread forward. Click it and let's keep going together.